The year 2347 brought humanity to the edges of known space with ships faster than anything the galaxy had seen before. Captain Daniel Harper stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge and watched the stars blur past the viewport as his crew worked at their stations. Lisa Monroe sat at navigation with her fingers dancing across holographic displays, while Kevin Price monitored the engine room from his console. Amy Sullivan checked security protocols for the third time that hour, because she never trusted empty space. Gregory Hayes hunched over his science station analyzing stellar formations that nobody had mapped before. They were 6 months into a mission that was supposed to be routine: survey the Andromeda Fringe and catalog anything useful for the colonies that would follow. Earth needed resources, and humanity had the technology to take them from wherever they wanted. The galaxy was theirs for the taking, or so everyone back home believed. The signal came through on a frequency so old that the ship's computer took 20 minutes to recognize it as communication. Lisa looked up from her station with confusion on her face and called Daniel over to listen. The sound was rhythmic and pulsing like a heartbeat made of static, and underneath it were voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Oracle was the ship's artificial intelligence, and it worked for 3 hours to translate fragments of the message. When the translation finally appeared on the screens, everyone on the bridge went quiet. "Turn back. This space is sealed. Death awaits the curious." The words repeated in an endless loop, transmitted from somewhere beyond the Andromeda Fringe where no human ship had ever traveled. Gregory pulled up star charts and overlaid them with the signal's origin point. His hands shook slightly as he magnified the image to show a sector of space that appeared on no official maps. Kevin ran a scan and found energy signatures that matched no known technology. Amy wanted to report it immediately and turn the ship around, but Daniel stared at the readings with the kind of look that Lisa had learned to recognize over 5 years of service. It was the look that meant he was going to push forward despite the danger. Before Daniel could give any orders, the communications array lit up with an incoming transmission marked Priority Alpha. The seal of the Galactic Council appeared on screen, and everyone straightened in their seats because the Council never contacted exploration vessels directly. Ambassador Zelthar appeared in holographic form, standing 8 feet tall with scales that shimmered green and gold in the bridge lighting. His species was called the Vorkesh, and they had been traveling the stars for 10,000 years before humans discovered fire. The ambassador's voice was deep and carried the weight of absolute certainty when he spoke. He told them that the sector beyond the Andromeda Fringe had been quarantined by unanimous decision of 12 species over 10 millennia ago. Every civilization that entered that space either vanished completely or returned changed in ways that made death seem merciful by comparison. The Vorkesh had lost 30 ships there. The Hetherians had lost an entire colony world. The Nexari had fought a civil war over what their explorers brought back and nearly destroyed themselves in the process. Zelthar said the warnings were not suggestions or guidelines meant to be questioned. They were absolute boundaries established through blood and extinction. He told Daniel to turn his ship around and never speak of what they had found. The transmission ended before anyone could respond, and the bridge fell into uncomfortable silence. Daniel reported everything to Earth Command through quantum relay and waited for orders. Commander Patricia Wells appeared on screen 6 hours later, sitting in her office at Fleet Headquarters with Admiral George Bennett standing behind her like a statue. Patricia had earned her position through 30 years of service, and she was known for making decisions that kept people alive. George Bennett was different. He had risen through the ranks during the resource wars and believed that humanity's survival depended on taking what they needed before someone else did. Patricia read the Council's warning aloud and looked directly at Daniel through the camera. She said the warnings were concerning, and that any reasonable commander would respect the experience of civilizations older than humanity. George interrupted her before she could finish. He stepped into frame, and his voice was hard when he spoke. The Admiral said that every species in the galaxy had tried to limit human expansion since the day humans left Earth. They feared competition, and they feared that humanity would surpass them given enough time and resources. George pulled up resource scans that Kevin had transmitted along with the warning. The forbidden sector showed deposits of rare elements that could revolutionize energy production and extend humanity's reach by centuries. The elements were worth more than entire planets, and they sat in space that other species had simply abandoned out of fear. He called it superstition dressed up as wisdom, and said that humanity had faced dangers before without running away. Patricia argued for caution, but George had already made his decision. He authorized a reconnaissance mission with specific parameters. The Horizon's Edge would enter the Forbidden Zone and conduct surface-level scans only. They would not land on any planets or interact with any structures they found. At the first sign of genuine danger, they would retreat immediately and report their findings. George said it was a reasonable compromise between caution and opportunity. Daniel received the orders in writing 20 minutes later. Amy wanted to file a formal protest, but Kevin pointed out that orders were orders regardless of how anyone felt about them. Lisa ran calculations for the safest approach vector while Gregory downloaded every piece of historical data about the sector that existed in Council archives. Most of it was heavily redacted or written in languages so old that translation was impossible. The Horizon's Edge turned toward the Forbidden Sector and accelerated to maximum cruise speed. The Galactic Council transmitted 12 more warnings over the next 48 hours. Each message came from a different species, and each one was more desperate than the last. The Vorkesh sent technical data showing what happened to ships that entered the sector. The Hetharians transmitted video logs that showed their explorers going insane within hours of crossing the boundary. The Nexari sent a single message that was just one word repeated 1,000 times. Don't. Daniel ordered the crew to ignore the transmissions and focus on their mission. He told them they were trained professionals exploring unknown space, which was exactly what humanity did best. The ship crossed the boundary 3 days after receiving authorization and passed through a shimmering barrier of energy that bent light in impossible ways. Every screen on the bridge went black for exactly 10 seconds. When they came back online, all external communications were dead. They were alone in the Forbidden Sector with no way to call for help, and nothing but warnings from civilizations that had learned too late that some doors should never be opened. The first thing they saw after crossing the barrier was death floating in the void. Hundreds of ships drifted in the darkness like tombstones marking graves that nobody would ever visit. Lisa brought the Horizon's Edge to a crawl and navigated between the derelict vessels while Gregory scanned each one with instruments that were struggling to make sense of what they detected. The ships came from dozens of different species, and some of them were so ancient that their hull designs predated human civilization by thousands of years. Kevin pulled up close-range images and zoomed in on a massive carrier that looked like it had been built by the Vorkesh, based on the scale patterns etched into its armor. Plating, Amy wanted to board one of the ships in search for survivors, or at least some kind of log that would explain what happened. Daniel authorized a remote drone sweep instead, because he was not ready to risk his crew on vessels that had been floating dead in space for who knew how long. The drones launched from the cargo bay and crossed the distance to the nearest derelict in under 2 minutes. Their cameras transmitted images back to the bridge, and everyone watched in silence as the drone entered through a hull breach near what used to be the engineering section. The interior of the ship was pristine. No damage to the walls or floors, no signs of fire or decompression or any kind of struggle. The drone floated through empty corridors where crew stations still had personal items sitting on desks, as if the operators had just stepped away for a moment. Gregory directed the drone to the bridge, and they found seats arranged around command consoles that still had power running through their circuits. The ship was functional and intact with life support systems that had been designed to run for centuries without maintenance. It had simply been abandoned by a crew that left no trace of where they went or why. Kevin ran the same scan on 12 other ships and found the same result every time. No bodies, no blood, no signs of violence or mechanical failure. The ships had not been attacked or damaged in any way that instruments could detect. Their crews had simply disappeared as if reality had erased them from existence. Lisa marked each derelict on the navigation map, and the pattern formed a trail that led deeper into the sector toward something that registered on sensors as a gravity well too large to be natural. Gregory pulled up the readings, and his face went pale when he saw the numbers. The gravity well was producing readings that violated known physics. It was pulling on spacetime itself and creating distortions that made navigation computers crash whenever they tried to plot a course through the affected area. Amy checked the ship's power levels and reported that something was draining their reserves at a rate so slow that nobody would notice unless they were specifically looking for it. Every minute they spent in this sector, they lost a fraction of their energy to something that sensors could not identify or locate. Daniel made the decision to investigate the source of the gravity well despite protests from half the crew. He said they had come this far, and turning back with no answers would mean another ship would be sent to do the same thing. Better to find out what was happening now than to let someone else die trying later. Lisa plotted the safest course she could manage, and the horizon's edge moved deeper into the sector while alarms blinked warnings about gravitational stress on the hull. The planet appeared on screens like a jewel floating in the void. Its surface was covered in crystalline towers that reached up through the atmosphere and into space itself. The towers were connected by bridges made of pure energy that pulsed with colors that human eyes were not designed to process. Kevin ran every scan he knew and reported that the planet should not exist. Its mass was too low for its size. Its atmosphere was too thick for its gravity. The energy running through those towers was producing more power than a dozen stars combined, and it was being drawn from somewhere that instruments could not detect. Daniel ordered a landing party, and Amy immediately volunteered because that was her job, even though every instinct she had was screaming at her to refuse. Gregory insisted on coming because he wanted to study the structures up close and collect samples that might explain what happened to all those ships. Daniel would lead the team himself because he was not the kind of captain who sent people into danger while he stayed safe on the ship. Lisa and Kevin would maintain orbit and monitor communications in case something went wrong. The shuttle descended through the atmosphere and landed near the base of the largest tower. Daniel stepped out onto the surface wearing an environmental suit and looked up at the structure that stretched so far into the sky that its top disappeared beyond the clouds. The tower was smooth and featureless except for symbols carved into its base in languages that Gregory's translator struggled to process. When the translation finally appeared on their helmet displays, the words made Amy take a step backward. We were arrogant. We thought we could control it. We were wrong. The same message repeated in hundreds of different languages, covering every surface of every tower within scanning range. Gregory moved from symbol to symbol, recording everything while Daniel and Amy explored the area around the landing site. They found ruins of settlements built by species that had come before. Research stations with equipment still sitting on tables. Monuments with warnings carved in stone and metal. Every message said the same thing in different ways. Turn back, do not enter. Death is here. Gregory found a doorway at the base of the largest tower and reported that it led down into the planet rather than up into the structure. Daniel approved exploration against Amy's strong objections, and the three of them descended into darkness that their lights could barely penetrate. The stairs went down for what felt like miles until they reached a chamber so vast that their lights could not find the far walls. In the center of that chamber was a sphere of absolute darkness. Amy had seen black holes on monitors, and she had seen the void of deep space from observation decks. This was different. The sphere was not just dark. It was an absence, a place where light went to die and reality ended at its surface. The sphere pulsed with a rhythm that matched a heartbeat, and Gregory moved toward it like he was being pulled by invisible strings. Daniel grabbed his arm and tried to stop him, but Gregory shook him off with strength that should not have been possible in the planet's low gravity. Gregory activated his scanning equipment and reached toward the sphere with instruments extended. The moment the scanner touched that darkness, the sphere expanded in a flash that filled the entire chamber. Gregory screamed, but not in pain. He screamed like someone who had just learned a secret that shattered everything they thought they knew about existence. The darkness pulled back into its original shape, and Gregory stood exactly where he had been before. His suit was undamaged. His equipment was still functioning. But when he turned to face Daniel and Amy, his eyes were wrong. They were normal eyes with the right color and the right shape, but they reflected the void. When Daniel looked into those eyes, he saw the sphere looking back at him. Gregory smiled and said he was fine. He said he finally understood. He said they needed to bring samples back to the ship for study. Amy wanted to quarantine him immediately, but Daniel was shaken by what he had seen and made the mistake of believing Gregory. When he said everything was normal, they returned to the shuttle and launched back to the horizon's edge with Gregory sitting quietly in his seat analyzing data on his portable display. He worked during the entire flight without speaking, and Amy watched him from across the cabin with her hand resting on the weapon she had not drawn. When they docked with the ship, Gregory went straight to his laboratory and began running tests on the readings he had collected. Daniel reported to Lisa and Kevin that the mission had been successful, and they had found the source of the anomalies in the sector. Nobody noticed that the sphere had followed them. It appeared 300 meters off the starboard side of the ship, maintaining perfect position relative to their velocity and heading. It did not register on any scanner or detector or sensor array. It was invisible to every instrument the ship possessed, but anyone who looked through the viewport on the starboard observation deck could see it floating in space like a wound in reality. A sphere of darkness that should not exist, and could not be explained, and had somehow left the planet to follow the horizon's edge wherever it went. Gregory worked through the night without sleeping or eating or taking any breaks. When morning came by ship time, he called Daniel to the laboratory and showed him calculations that made no sense. He said the sphere was not a threat. He said it was a gift. He said it was offering them a chance to evolve beyond the limitations that biology imposed on consciousness. Daniel asked what he meant, and Gregory smiled with eyes that reflected something darker than space. He said they would all understand soon. Gregory worked for 48 hours straight without stopping, and nobody thought it was strange at first because scientists often got obsessed with their research. Lisa checked on him twice during her shift and found him staring at data streams on multiple monitors, with his fingers typing faster than she had ever seen before. He told her he was fine when she asked. He said he had never felt more focused in his entire life. His eyes still had that strange quality where they seemed to reflect something that was not in the room, but Lisa convinced herself it was just the light from the screens. Kevin noticed the power drain increasing and ran diagnostics on every system trying to find the source. The ship's reactor was producing the same output as always, but somehow they were losing energy to something external. He tracked the drain to the starboard side where the sphere floated in space, maintaining its position relative to the ship. When he tried to scan the sphere, his instruments gave readings that made no sense. The sphere had mass but no volume. It produced gravity but had no density. It existed in their space but somehow occupied no physical location that sensors could measure. Daniel called a meeting in the conference room and ordered everyone to attend, including Gregory, who protested that his work was too important to interrupt. Amy watched Gregory carefully during the entire meeting because she had spent 10 years learning to recognize threats, and everything about his behavior set off alarms in her mind. Daniel asked for status reports and everyone gave updates on their areas of responsibility. When it came to Gregory's turn, he stood up and walked to the viewport instead of sitting at the table like everyone else. The sphere was visible through the window, hanging in space like a hole cut into reality. Gregory placed his hand against the glass and smiled in a way that made Amy reach for her weapon. He said the sphere was not following them. He said they were following it. He explained that the sphere existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and what they saw was just a shadow of something far larger. The real sphere existed in a place where consciousness could exist without biological limitations, where thought was reality and evolution meant shedding the prison of flesh. Lisa interrupted him and asked what he was talking about. Gregory turned away from the viewport and his eyes reflected the darkness of the sphere when the light hit them at certain angles. He said he had been chosen to understand. He said the sphere touched his mind when he scanned it and showed him truths that would take 1,000 years to explain in human language. The civilizations that came before had not been destroyed. They had evolved. They had accepted the gift and transcended their physical forms to become something greater. Kevin stood up from his chair and told Gregory he needed to report to medical immediately. Amy agreed and moved toward Gregory with her hand still on her weapon. Daniel ordered Gregory to submit to a full medical scan and quarantine until they understood what was happening. Gregory laughed, and the sound was wrong. It had harmonics that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. He said they could not quarantine an idea. He said they could not contain enlightenment with locked doors and armed guards. Amy grabbed Gregory's arm to escort him to medical, but the moment she touched him, she felt something cold wash through her mind. It lasted only a second before she pulled away, but in that second she saw the sphere from the inside. She saw consciousness existing without bodies. She saw thoughts connected in a vast network that spanned dimensions. She saw evolution not as biology, but as the shedding of biological limits. Then Gregory released her and the vision ended, and Amy stood shaking in the conference room while everyone stared at her. Daniel immediately ordered Amy to medical along with Gregory. Kevin and Lisa were instructed to maintain ship operations and avoid any contact with the sphere or anyone who had been near it. Gregory went willingly to medical now because he said it did not matter. He said the transformation had already begun, and medical scans would only confirm what he already knew. Amy followed with her weapon drawn, but her hand was shaking, because the vision she had seen was still playing in her mind like a recording she could not stop. The medical bay ran every scan available, and found nothing wrong with Gregory's body. His cells were normal. His brain activity was normal. His vitals were exactly what they should be for a healthy human male in his 30s. But he no longer needed sleep. He no longer needed food. When asked to explain his behavior, he said he was more himself now than he had ever been before. The biological imperatives that drove humans to eat and sleep and reproduce were background noise he could finally ignore. Lisa took over monitoring the sphere while Kevin worked on finding a way to break free of its influence. She stared at it through the viewport for too long during her shift. The darkness was hypnotic in the way it seemed to swallow everything, including thought itself. She found herself wondering what it would be like to exist without fear or doubt, or the constant anxiety that came with being alive. The sphere pulsed with that heartbeat rhythm, and Lisa realized she could hear it even though the viewport was sealed and space carried no sound. The whispers came next. They did not come through her ears. They came from inside her mind, speaking in a language she did not know, but somehow understood. The whispers said she was imprisoned in flesh. They said biology was a cage. They said evolution meant breaking free. Lisa pulled herself away from the viewport and returned to her station, but the whispers did not stop. They followed her through her duties and into her sleep cycle, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the sphere waiting for her. Kevin found Lisa standing at the viewport during what should have been her rest period. She was staring at the sphere with her palm pressed against the glass just like Gregory had done. Her eyes had the same reflective quality, and when Kevin called her name, she did not respond immediately. He touched her shoulder and she turned to face him with a smile that looked wrong on her face. She said she understood now. She said the sphere was offering them a gift and they were fools to refuse it. Daniel realized they were losing the crew to something that medical scans could not detect and weapons could not fight. He quarantined both Gregory and Lisa in separate sections of the ship, with armed guards posted outside their doors. Amy volunteered to stand watch even though she had her own exposure to whatever the sphere was doing. She said she could resist it because she had seen it once and refused its offer. Daniel was not sure if that made her safer or more vulnerable. Kevin worked desperately to find a way to escape the sphere's influence. He tried increasing engine power to outrun it, but the sphere maintained its position effortlessly. He tried changing course in random directions, but the sphere followed every maneuver perfectly. He tried shutting down all external sensors, hoping that breaking their connection to it would help. But the sphere remained visible through every viewport on the starboard side. It was not following them through any physical means. It was connected to them through something deeper than location or velocity. Gregory and Lisa began speaking in unison, even though they were in separate rooms with no communication possible between them. The guards reported hearing them say the same words at the same time in voices that harmonized impossibly. They spoke about transcendence. They spoke about evolution. They spoke about the collective consciousness waiting beyond the physical realm. They invited everyone listening to join them. They said resistance was temporary because eventually every living thing that encountered the sphere would understand what it offered. Daniel knew they had to warn Earth Command before whatever was happening spread beyond his ship. He broke protocol and sent a distress signal on every frequency available. The signal contained everything they had learned about the sphere and the forbidden sector and the civilizations that vanished after entering this space. He recorded a personal message explaining that they had been wrong to ignore the warnings. He said the Galactic Council had not been protecting territory or hiding resources. They had been protecting everyone from a transformation that ended civilizations not through violence but through evolution into something that could not coexist with biological life. The transmission sent but no reply came back. The barrier that surrounded the forbidden sector blocked all communications from passing through. They were alone with the sphere and with crew members who were changing into something that was no longer human. Amy reported that she could still hear the whispers trying to convince her to accept the gift. Kevin admitted he could hear them too. Daniel felt them at the edge of his consciousness like voices calling from a distant room. The final log entry from Captain Daniel Harper was recorded 72 hours after their first encounter with the sphere. His voice was strained and tired when he spoke into the recorder. He said they had made a terrible mistake. He said the warnings from the Galactic Council were not about danger in the traditional sense. They were about a choice that every species eventually faced when they reached a certain level of technology and curiosity. The choice to remain biological and limited or to transcend into something greater and lose everything that made them who they were. Daniel said he did not know if anyone would ever hear his message. He did not know if the barrier would ever fall or if another ship would be stupid. Earth Command waited 3 weeks for contact from the horizon's edge before admitting something had gone wrong. Admiral George Bennett stood in the command center watching the communications array cycle through frequencies trying to reach Daniel Harper's ship. Commander Patricia Wells stood beside him with her arms crossed and her face set in the expression she wore when she was proven right about something nobody wanted to hear. The silence from the forbidden sector was absolute, and after 21 days of nothing, Admiral Bennett made the decision to send a rescue mission. The Galactic Council learned about the planned rescue within hours, and Ambassador Zelthar requested an emergency session with the United Earth Assembly. President Caroline Foster sat in the assembly chamber with her cabinet surrounding her, while representatives from 12 alien species materialized as holograms around the circular room. The ambassador from the Vorkesh Empire stepped forward first, and his voice carried 10,000 years of bitter experience when he spoke. Zelthar told the assembly about his people's first contact with the Forbidden Sector 7,000 years before humans existed. The Vorkesh had been explorers and conquerors who believed the galaxy existed for them to claim. They sent 30 ships into the sector that other species warned them to avoid. Those ships returned 6 months later, but the crews were no longer Vorkesh. They spoke in harmonized voices. They moved in perfect synchronization. They claimed they had evolved beyond biological limitation and invited their homeworld to join them in transcendence. The Vorkesh government refused and tried to quarantine the transformed crews. The transformed responded by forcing the evolution on others through some method that did not require physical contact. People who spent time near the transformed began to change. They stopped eating and sleeping. They spoke in unison with others who had changed. They lost their individual identities and became parts of something larger. The Vorkesh had no choice but to destroy their own transformed people before the infection spread across their entire civilization. Representative from the Hytharian collective spoke next and described how her species lost an entire colony world to the same phenomenon. The Hytharians had believed they could study the transformation and find a way to reverse it. They were wrong. The transformed spread faster than any biological plague, and the colony had to be sterilized from orbit. 15 billion Hytharians died in a single day because their leaders waited too long to accept that some forms of evolution were indistinguishable from extinction. The Nexari delegates shared recordings from their civil war that had lasted 3 years and killed more of their species than any conflict in their history. Half their population had been transformed before military forces managed to contain and eliminate the infected. The recordings showed Nexari fighting Nexari in battles where one side used conventional weapons and the other side phased in and out of normal space, making themselves nearly impossible to kill. The war only ended when the Nexari developed weapons that collapsed the transformed back into normal reality where they could be destroyed. Ambassador Zelthar presented these histories to the United Earth Assembly and explained that every species in the Council had learned the same lesson. The Forbidden Sector was not forbidden because it contained weapons or hostile aliens. It was forbidden because it offered a transformation that appeared beneficial, but resulted in the loss of everything that made a species what they were. The transformed claimed they had evolved, but from the perspective of those who remained biological, they had simply been replaced by something else wearing their faces. President Caroline Foster listened to the testimonies and consulted with her advisors, while the council representatives waited. Defense Secretary Richard Cole argued that the council was trying to manipulate Earth through fear. He said humanity had faced existential threats before and survived through strength and determination. He recommended sending a military force large enough to rescue the Horizon's Edge crew and eliminate any threat they encountered. General Linda Hayes disagreed and said the council testimonies were too consistent to be fabrications or exaggerations. The debate in the assembly chamber lasted 6 hours before President Foster made her decision. She thanked the council for their warnings and assured them Earth would proceed with appropriate caution. The council representatives faded from view and the chamber fell into tense silence. Defense Secretary Cole immediately began organizing the rescue mission with Admiral Bennett, while General Hayes filed an official protest that was overruled by presidential authority. The warship Valiant Dawn launched 3 days later, under the command of Captain Stephen Murphy. The ship carried a crew of 300 and enough firepower to destroy a planet if necessary. Stephen had served in the resource wars and fought in battles that most civilians preferred to forget. He believed in overwhelming force as the solution to any problem, and his orders were clear. Enter the Forbidden Sector and extract the Horizon's Edge crew by any means necessary. If the crew could not be saved, then destroy all evidence of what happened and return home. The Galactic Council learned about the Valiant Dawn through intelligence sources, and Ambassador Zelthar requested another audience with President Foster. This time he did not speak in the measured diplomatic tone he had used before. He told the president that Earth's arrogance would doom not only humanity, but potentially every species in the galaxy. The transformation did not respect borders or treaties. It spread through contact and comprehension. Once it escaped the Forbidden Sector, there would be no way to contain it. President Foster tried to explain that abandoning 300 humans without attempting rescue was not something Earth's government could accept. Ambassador Zelthar said 300 lives were nothing compared to the trillions that would be lost if the transformation spread beyond the quarantine zone. The conversation ended with both sides frustrated and angry. The council voted to impose sanctions on Earth, and several member species began moving military assets into position around human space. The Valiant Dawn crossed into the Forbidden Sector, and all communications with Earth ceased exactly as they had with the Horizon's Edge. Captain Stephen Murphy sent his last transmission as the ship passed through the energy barrier. He reported seeing the derelict vessels that Daniel Harper had described. He confirmed the presence of unknown structures on long-range sensors. Then his voice cut off mid-sentence and Earth Command heard nothing more. Admiral Bennett waited 72 hours before declaring the Valiant Dawn lost. President Foster addressed the nation from the Capitol building, with her face showing the strain of leading during a crisis that nobody fully understood. She explained that 2 ships and over 400 humans had vanished into the Forbidden Sector. She admitted that Earth had made mistakes by ignoring warnings from civilizations with more experience than humanity possessed. She did not say what would happen next because she did not know. The Galactic Council prepared for the worst. Military forces from 8 species moved to blockade positions around the Forbidden Sector. The Vorkesh provided technical data on weapons that could destroy transformed individuals before they spread. The Nexari shared combat tactics that had worked during their civil war. The Hytharians contributed research on detection methods that could identify transformed individuals before they revealed themselves. Every species that had survived contact with the phenomenon contributed something to a defensive strategy that everyone hoped would never be needed. 3 months passed with no activity from the Forbidden Sector. Earth Command sent automated probes to the boundary, but they lost signal the moment they crossed through the energy barrier. Long-range sensors detected nothing unusual. The derelict ships remained in their positions. The planet with crystalline towers showed no changes. The sector appeared dead and empty, just as it had been for thousands of years. Then the ships began emerging. The first one appeared on sensors at the edge of the Forbidden Zone, moving at speeds that should not have been possible for a vessel of its size. Earth Command identified it as the Valiant Dawn, but the ship had been modified in ways that violated every principle of engineering. The hull had restructures itself into geometric patterns. The engines produced energy signatures that matched nothing in human technology. When traffic control hailed the ship, the response came in voices that spoke in perfect unison. Captain Stephen Murphy's voice was there among the harmonized chorus, but it was not him anymore. The transformed crew invited humanity to join them in evolution. They spoke of enlightenment and transcendence. They promised an end to suffering and limitation. They said the biological form was a prison, and they had found the key. Earth Command ordered the Valiant Dawn to maintain its position and submit to inspection. The ship ignored the order and continued toward the nearest human colony. Defense Secretary Cole authorized military intervention, and 3 patrol ships moved to intercept. The Valiant Dawn did not respond to weapons fire. Missiles passed through sections of the hull that phased out of normal space. Energy weapons were absorbed and redirected. The transformed ship reached the colony despite all attempts to stop it, and when it achieved orbit, something changed in the people on the surface. Reports came in of colonists abandoning their duty. The transformed ships reached the outer colonies 3 months after emerging from the Forbidden Sector, and what happened next would haunt humanity for generations. Lieutenant Jacob Turner commanded a defensive position at the Kepler colony when the first transformed vessel entered orbit. The ship was originally a human transport called the Morning Star, but it had been restructured into something that hurt to look at directly. Jacob ordered his squadron to intercept, but before they could engage, the transformed crew began broadcasting. The voices came through every communication channel simultaneously, speaking in harmonics that no human throat should produce. They said they were offering freedom from biological limitation. They said consciousness could exist without flesh. They said fear and pain and death were choices that humanity no longer needed to make. Jacob ordered his communications officer to shut down all receivers, but the voices did not stop. They came through the walls and through the air and through the minds of everyone who heard them. 3 members of Jacob's crew stopped responding to orders within the first hour. They stood at viewport staring at the transformed ship with expressions of wonder on their faces. When Jacob tried to pull them away from the windows, they looked at him with eyes that reflected something darker than space. They spoke in unison, saying they finally understood. They said biological life was a cage and they had found the key. Jacob ordered them restrained, but the transformation was not something that could be stopped with handcuffs or locked doors. The infected crew members began changing others through proximity alone. People who spent time near them started hearing the whispers. They stopped eating and sleeping. They spoke about transcendence and evolution. Jacob watched his squadron fall apart as more people transformed every hour. He sent desperate reports to Earth Command describing how the infection spread not through physical contact, but through understanding. Once someone comprehended what the transformed were offering, resistance became almost impossible. The Kepler colony had to be evacuated within 48 hours. 30,000 people fled on transport ships while 10,000 remained behind, speaking in harmonized voices about the gift they had received. Jacob Turner was among the last to leave, and he watched from his shuttle as the colony became something else. The buildings restructured themselves. The streets rearranged into geometric patterns. The entire settlement transformed into architecture that existed partially outside normal space. Similar reports came from 6 other colonies over the following weeks. The transformed were spreading faster than military forces could respond. Earth Defense Fleet destroyed 3 transformed ships, but 5 more emerged from the Forbidden Sector to replace them. President Caroline Foster held emergency meetings with her cabinet, trying to find solutions that did not involve killing thousands of humans who had been transformed against their will. General Linda Hayes presented the casualty projections during a meeting that lasted 16 hours. If the transformation reached Earth itself, the death toll would be measured in billions. Defense Secretary Richard Cole argued that humanity had no choice but to fight, even if it meant using weapons that would make heroes into mass murderers. President Foster asked if there were any other options, and the room fell silent because everyone knew the answer. Ambassador Zelthar contacted Earth Command through back channels and offered a solution that the Galactic Council had held in reserve for thousands of years. The Vorkesh had developed a weapon capable of collapsing the gateway at the heart of the Forbidden Sector. The weapon would seal the rift between dimensions and trap everything inside permanently. Every transformed ship currently outside the sector would lose its connection to the source and either die or fade away, like dreams upon waking. But someone would have to deliver the weapon manually to the Dark Planet, and that person would not return. President Foster asked how many people were currently trapped in the Forbidden Sector, either transformed or lost. The estimate was over 600 humans plus crew members from the Valiant Dawn and Horizon's Edge. Sealing the gateway meant abandoning them forever. It meant accepting that they would exist in a state beyond death or life, trapped in a dimension that biological minds could not comprehend. Defense Secretary Cole said 600 lives were acceptable losses compared to billions. General Hayes agreed, but her face showed what that agreement cost her. Captain Natalie Brooks volunteered for the mission before anyone could ask. She commanded an experimental ship called Mercury's Flight that was fast enough to potentially reach the dark planet before transformed vessels could intercept. Natalie had lost her husband and daughter to the transformation when they were stationed at the Kepler colony. She had nothing left but duty and revenge and a desperate need to make their loss mean something. President Foster approved the mission, and the Galactic Council provided the weapon. It was a quantum singularity device that would collapse space-time at a specific location, creating a permanent barrier between dimensions. The Verkesh technicians who delivered it looked at Natalie with something approaching pity. They had used the same weapon 7,000 years ago to seal their own people inside the Forbidden Sector. They knew exactly what she was volunteering to do. Mercury's Flight entered the Forbidden Sector with a crew of 12 volunteers who knew they were flying a suicide mission. The ship was intercepted by 5 transformed vessels within hours of crossing the barrier. The transformed crews broadcast their message of evolution and enlightenment, trying to convince Natalie and her people to accept the gift. Natalie ordered weapons hot and engaged the enemy with everything her ship possessed. The battle lasted 3 hours and cost Mercury's Flight most of its crew. The transformed ships phased in and out of normal space, making them nearly impossible to hit. They absorbed energy weapons and redirected missiles. They did not try to destroy Mercury's Flight because destruction was not their purpose. They tried to board and transform the crew. Natalie vented sections of her ship into space to prevent boarding parties from reaching the bridge. She watched good people die, protecting a mission that would doom hundreds of their fellow humans to eternal imprisonment. The Mercury's Flight reached the dark planet with hull breaches across 60% of its structure and only 3 crew members still alive. Natalie piloted the dying ship through the atmosphere, while her engineer kept the engines running through sheer determination and emergency repairs. They landed near the crystalline tower where Daniel Harper had first encountered the sphere, and Natalie suited up with the quantum device. Secured to her back, the descent into the chamber took 20 minutes, and Natalie spent every second thinking about her family. She thought about her daughter's laugh and her husband's smile and the life they could have lived if humanity had listened to warnings, instead of assuming it knew better than civilizations 10,000 years old. She reached the chamber where the sphere waited and saw it pulsing with that heartbeat rhythm that had destroyed so many lives. Natalie armed the device and set it for a 30-second delay. She looked at the sphere one final time and felt its pull. The whispers came promising understanding and peace and reunion with everyone she had lost. They said her husband and daughter were waiting inside the sphere in a place where death and separation did not exist. They said she could join them. They said she could evolve. For a moment, Natalie wanted to believe them. For a moment, she wanted to drop the device and walk into the darkness and find the people she loved. Then she remembered the colonies that fell. She remembered the crews that transformed. She remembered that her husband and daughter were not waiting in the sphere. They were gone, and what wore their memories was something else. Natalie activated the device and whispered an apology to everyone she was about to trap forever. The explosion was not physical. Reality itself shuddered as the quantum singularity collapsed the gateway between dimensions. The sphere imploded, pulling everything in the chamber toward a single point of infinite density. Natalie felt herself being torn apart at the molecular level. She felt the connection between dimensions severing. She felt the screams of hundreds of transformed humans as their link to the collective consciousness was cut. Then she felt nothing. The forbidden sector sealed itself with a barrier that nothing could cross. Every transformed human in normal space collapsed simultaneously as their connection to the source ended. Some died instantly. Some screamed and clawed at their own faces, trying to tear out the whispers that suddenly went silent. Some simply faded away like smoke dispersing in wind. The transformation reversed for a few, but most were too far gone. Their bodies remained, but the people they had been were lost forever. Earth Command broadcast the news that the threat had been eliminated, but nobody celebrated. President Foster addressed a planet in mourning and admitted that humanity's arrogance had cost over 1,000 lives, including the brave volunteers who sealed the gateway. She announced new policies restricting exploration into regions that elder species marked as dangerous. She signed treaties with the Galactic Council accepting limitations on human expansion for the first time in history. Admiral George Bennett faced court-martial for ordering the initial mission into the Forbidden Sector. He was found guilty of negligence and